You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My unusually well-informed guest today is Hamza Khan. Hamza is Managing Director at the Student Life Network. He is a two-time TEDx speaker, author, and award-winning marketer. Today, Hamza and I are discussing his book titled Leadership Reinvented. Hamza, welcome to the show.
Tim, thank you so much for having me. This is an absolute honor, I must say.
It is absolutely my pleasure. Thank you. So let's talk about your book first.
Okay.
How much of a role did COVID play in the timing and inspiration of your book?
I don't think this book would have been written without COVID. The events at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically around the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that characterized March of 2020, led to the perfect confluence of events that shocked me into the impetus for the book. So there's that. The impetus for the book came as a result of COVID-19, but the time and the space needed to write the book was also made available to me by the lull that all of my different projects fell into. So that rare convergence of factors allowed the book to be produced.
And you describe leadership in the time of COVID as an audition for leadership in the years to come. Can you expand on that?
Absolutely. So a topic that I've been meditating on quite a bit, and this has to do with one of the three topics that I speak about quite a bit. So I'm a future of work thinker, researcher, speaker, author, etc. And my three pillars, if you will, are productivity, resilience, and leadership. I've explored productivity a lot in my earlier career. Resilience, specifically burnout and resilience, has been the focus of, I'd say, the last decade. And now I'm embarking on this mission to understand how leadership connects to all three in the future of work. So leadership during the time of COVID, or at least during the time of a crisis, as being an audition, is an idea that stood out to me when I saw it on Twitter during COVID-19. And I believe it was tweeted out by Naval Ravikant, who is the ex-CEO, or founder rather, of AngelList, who said something along the lines of, leadership in the coming weeks is an audition to lead for the years to come, or for the future, something along those lines. So I've been meditating on this idea that I've studied quite a bit, and I'm still studying in my research around burnout and resilience. It's the concept of the amygdala hijack, the part of our brain that's responsible for executive function, for complex decision-making and long-term planning, known as the prefrontal cortex, is essentially hijacked by the part of our brain known as the amygdala during times of unexpected stress. And what happens during this hijack is all the blood is drained from the prefrontal cortex and sent to the extremities of our body, preparing us for one of three states: fight, flight, or freeze. So my understanding of what happened during COVID, and I saw this firsthand, not just in the companies that I consulted with, but in the company that I'm leading right now, is that we were helpless. We defaulted back to some base programming, that there was no conscious decisions made, at least during the very early days of the pandemic. Every leader across the world, regardless if you were a nonprofit leader, a Fortune 10 leader, a government leader, whatever leadership position you occupied, you were helpless. And you basically booted up this dormant program that you had been training for the days, the weeks, the years, the decades preceding that leadership moment. So who you were in the throes of the early days of the pandemic was a direct reflection of the type of leader that you would be during the pandemic and certainly after the pandemic. So the idea of leadership during COVID being an audition is very much rooted in this idea: who you saw, your leader, your boss, if you're listening to this, if you are a leader, how you behaved, how you acted, your mode of thinking, being, and doing, and even play to a certain extent, was the most accurate reflection of your capabilities as a leader. That's what I meant by that.
So that's really interesting. And I have this pet theory that the reason we like zombie movies so much is because almost everyone is like, you know, if it wasn't for everything holding me back, I'd be the best me I could be.
Yep.
And so the zombie apocalypse levels the playing field.
It does.
Like, aha, this is my shot, right?
Death as the prospect of death as the ultimate clarifying principle.
Yeah.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, the decisions you make when you are faced with complete and utter loss, I think, are a sometimes alarming reflection of your true value set. I think all of your values come into focus, or at least what happens in that moment is the values that perhaps you as a leader, and when I say you as leader, not you specifically, Tim, not me specifically, but leaders in general,
Right.
the values that we throw out of the window while we're in survival mode, when we're fighting, flying, or freezing, that absence or that presence of the value set is very fascinating to me. And we saw, and we're still seeing the ramifications, the long-term consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic wreaking havoc on all kinds of companies, all kinds of organizations. I mean, if we think about just right here at home in Canada, in Ontario, where I'm assuming you are as well, Tim.
That's right. Yeah.
We got to see a masterclass in in botched leadership when it came to COVID-19. Not going to name any names, but leaders in the know who we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about some of the values that really could make a difference, not just during the audition, but during the show after.
Sure.
Your book focuses on 4 values that you say are critical for leaders, and they are servitude, innovation, diversity, and empathy.
That is correct.
I put it in that order because it spells side, as you point out, SIDE, but we're going to start in the order that you, I think there was a logical order to the way you presented them. So let's start with empathy. Why is this value critical to leadership today?
One of the best quotes that I came across in doing some deep research into the elements of the book was by Jack Welch, the ex-CEO and chairman of General Electric, who said, if the rate of change on the inside of the or rather the other way around, if the rate of change on the outside of the organization exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. And the outside and inside in question that he was referring to was the environment of the organization, the inside of the organization and the outside environment of the organization. Empathy is critical to understanding how people are feeling, how they're thinking, on both sides of the organization. When we think about the complete value chain from your customer all the way to your board members, empathy is truly about, and I'm going to paraphrase Daniel Pink over here, it's about understanding other people by standing in their shoes, by seeing with their eyes, by feeling with their heart. And so that's why I started with empathy. I thought empathy would be a great place to start because this is an area where I think most leaders fail. I was reading a McKinsey report. I believe it was a McKinsey report that stated, and it was a survey of 3,000 executives, and they found that 60% of the time when an organization attempts to make the necessary changes to adapt to its external environment, they fail. And Harvard Business Review puts that number up even higher at 70%. And Fortune has stated very clearly in a 2002 study that the number one reason why organizations fail is avoidance. It's a lack of understanding of how the world around them is changing. So we have to start with empathy to get real about reality, essentially. And reality is that which is still there, even if we choose to look away.
Very
and
true.
The onus is on leaders to collect those data points, as difficult as they may be to collect. You as a leader right now might be listening to this thinking, I know how my employees are doing. And to that, I would challenge you and say, all right, if you believe that, go and ask them a tough question. Ask them if they're happy. Ask them if they're stressed. Ask them if they think you're doing a good job as a leader, and go into these interactions with no ego. Prepare to receive some very harsh feedback at times, but you need this. You need this to understand, because if you don't understand this, you will arrive at the 4th stage of the organization's life cycle where it has to decide if it's going to renew itself or not. And your ability as a leader, your ability as an organization to renew itself depends on how well you can estimate when that time of disruption is coming.
So you move smoothly from empathy, which is really about discovering, well, I'm paraphrasing, but you tell me if I'm on target. You're discovering what your customers and what your team members' desires are, what their challenges are. And then you move to servitude, which is really taking the attitude that I'm here to help you with that.
Yes.
How can you expand on what the value of servitude in leadership is?
Totally. So I delivered a TEDx talk back in 2015 titled Stop Managing, Start Leading. And I did it as a way to chronicle my leadership experiences up until that point, but make the case that the old paradigm of leadership that is somehow still tied up in like the 2nd and 3rd industrial revolution, where people are being managed from a place of distrust. Thinking about Douglas McGregor's theory X versus theory Y, the theory X style is being applied to knowledge workers, and we're being treated like factory workers. We're being expected to work all hours of the day. Our boundaries aren't being respected. We're assumed to be lazy, entitled, so on and so forth. I did that talk and I left it and I felt really good about it. And, it was moderately gaining traction. And then in the last 5 years, Tim, it's gone viral. It's gone viral. And it's like, I don't know what happened. I mean, I do know what happened, but I was in disbelief as to the rate of how far and wide it was spreading. It's gone worldwide. And it happens to be one of the talks that I'm usually noticed by other organizations, and they bring me in to speak about a whole host of different topics. Why I think that talk was so important is because it speaks to something that goes beyond the tension of millennials and older generations. It speaks to this growing frustration with the old way of doing things, where we're seeing it now, and there's so many realms in which this conflict is taking place. We're seeing it especially during COVID, where wealth discrepancies, income discrepancies are staggering right now. I mean, money has been flowing upwards to a small group of people, and it's been not redistributed equitably. We're seeing people threatening to leave their jobs en masse if they're forced to return back into the office. I mean, we're seeing burnout at a scale that has never been seen before. I'm still wrapping my head around it. All of this to me is easily solvable if we stop treating humans like resources and start treating them like people. If we as leaders get back to the root of what we're trying to do and start to lead from behind and ensure that everyone around us is better than us, if we focus less on maintaining power and distributing that and breathing the spirit of everything we know, all of our strategies, all of our knowledge and wisdom, and we act like true coaches, this is how everyone wins. But for some reason, and I don't know what it is, whether it's power, whether it's fear, whether it's greed, whether it's some sort of corruption that's happening at a scale that I can't comprehend right now. What we need to do as leaders is hit the reset button and get back to making everyone better. This is the thing that frustrates me the most. Sometimes leaders think they're on the court playing basketball with everyone else, but they're not. They're supposed to be coaches. And I talk extensively in the book about Phil Jackson, whose book 11 Rings was very influential, not just in my formation of this book, but also in my understanding of how to be a better leader. Our job is not to be on the court playing basketball. Our job is to be on the sidelines, motivating our team, training them, making the correct plays, and letting them do what they do best. So that's, in a roundabout way, the essence of servitude as a value in this book.
Excellent. So and in order to embrace or to use empathy to find what can be useful, and then use servitude as a way to sort of take the viewpoint that it's like servant leadership. It's I will help the team achieve, but the composition of the team matters too.
It does.
And you
absolutely.
get into diversity as another value. That's the third on the list. Can you talk a little bit about the role of diversity in leadership?
Oh, wow. Geez, how much time do we have, Tim? I'll try to keep
as much as you want.
I'll try to keep this one succinct because I feel like I could write a whole other book. Forget about a book. I could write several books on just this value alone. And I'm still, I would say, very nascent in my understanding of it. I don't have the depth of knowledge to speak about it in a way that is as informed as I would like it to be. So, like yourself, Tim, through your podcast and through your work outside of this with your agency and, through York University being in an academic institution, I take it that you are also a continuous learner. You're a lifelong learner. So, if I'm misspeaking over here, if I'm not using any of the terminology correctly, for any listeners out there, please forgive me. I'm still learning.
Yeah, we all are.
Okay. When it comes to diversity, I think that there has been a misunderstanding that I can see certainly take place across a wide array of organizations. It's that, diversity is often done in a very tokenistic way, in a very mascot-like way at organizations. Lip service is paid, certain people are placed in key positions, and an organization thinks they've done everything. And I don't know why that is. I have a lot of theories about that, but the thing is this. What an organization wants is they want diversity of background, experience, and perspective. That's what they want. They want to be able to ask a question of their team, whether it's at an all staff meeting, whether it's at a board meeting, whether it's in a survey, and they want to get a diversity of background, experience, and perspectives. You want to hear people say that when I was at this company, we did it this way. You want to hear people say, in my experience with this community, with these intersectionalities, this is what I think. What happens instead is when you have organizations in which you hire for cultural fit, you tend to hire people that look like you, that come from similar backgrounds, and you create homogenous teams. The problem, though, is that homogenous teams right now are not reflective, usually, especially here in North America, of the people that they serve. When you consider just diversity trends in North America alone, let's even localize it here to Toronto. If you have an organization, and I'm going to say this, if you have an organization that is comprised of mostly straight white men, okay, no disrespect, I'm just using that as an example. Or you know what? Let me even put myself into that situation. If I'm running an organization comprised of straight brown men, but all of our customers are from across the GTA, and we want to serve and reach as many people in the GTA as possible, both companies, Company A and Company B, are terribly misaligned with the diversity of the people that they're hoping to reach. So all of this is to say, if you want true diversity of background, perspective, and experience, it often correlates with diversity of race, diversity of gender, diversity of ability, diversity of age, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a great model. I think it was pioneered by the University of Michigan or Johns Hopkins University. I can't remember which one, but it's a diversity wheel that shows the many ways in which people can identify. It just shows a whole bunch of intersectionality. I think the onus is on leaders to look at their company, to look at themselves, to look at their board and ask, who's not here? Mm-hmm. Which voices, which perspectives, which experiences are missing from the table, and then staff accordingly. Because if you don't do that, then what happens is you miss the data necessary to calculate when disruption needs to happen. And I'm talking about self-disruption. That's the ideal. Ideally, a leader in a company wants to disrupt themselves before they are disrupted from forces without. And so in order to do that, get as much rich data and authentic data as you can. But if you have a homogenous team, it's very hard for you to do that. I think the homogeneity of the team is inversely proportional to the quality of data that you can get.
So I'm out there on a limb with you because I'm ill-equipped to really talk about diversity through experience anyway.
Many of us are. I would say most people are, and that's fine. Like
I guess learning. That's sort of the definition, right? Most people are at that median point. But nevertheless, we're in a safe space. Let's discuss it a little bit.
Yeah,
there's
I'd love to.
A couple of themes in there. One theme is that if you have a group of 10 people, they can't possibly hope to reflect the diversity of Toronto. Mm-hmm. And so that complicates how you develop the conviction in your own heart that you're doing enough for diversity and to be seen by others for diversity. Right. That's one challenge. And just because it's a challenge doesn't mean you give up, right? I'm not saying that, right? Because there's a tendency to, it's complicated, don't bother. I'm not saying that. The other thread I wanted to explore with you, like I want to give you time to talk about that, but then the other thing I want to explore is this notion that there's necessarily an overlap between experience diversity, thought diversity, and demographic or background diversity. You and I might find that we find more in common than I would necessarily if I picked a random white man down the street.
Totally, 100%.
So sometimes I worry, it's like when you say to a kid, eat your vegetables, they're good for you and they're delicious. And the kid's going to feed the vegetables to the dog and go, of course I finish my vegetables. I love them. They're delicious.
Yeah.
Right? Well, no, actually the main reason is they're good for you. And I don't believe you. Right. And people start to play games when they say, of course we're diverse. Yeah. We value diversity because it's good for our bottom line.
Right.
But that's not always necessarily true because there's a real skill to harnessing diversity.
Yep.
So anyway, I've thrown a lot of ideas out there.
This is great, right? I did this recently, and I don't remember the specifics of it, but I tried to reduce Toronto, looking at census data, down to a team of 10 people. What would a diverse representative team look like if you were to have a 10-person team that markets to the city of Toronto? And it would be, I think it was like 6 women out of 10. There's 1 LGBTQIA person on the team. There were 3 people of color. And I forget what it was, but it was surprising to me because I thought, whoa, like I thought Toronto or the GTA rather, was a lot more diverse based on the pockets that I'm in right now. But when you look at the data overall, I'm like, okay, so maybe this team wouldn't have to be as diverse as I thought. And I was like, but hold on, maybe I'm asking the wrong questions, because simply staffing up and having a diversity of people is not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to be able to understand and speak to your audience and represent the full human gradient, as I describe it in the book. So I think we have to go beyond just, token hires and satisfying some base metrics. All of those things, I mean, sorry, I don't want to say token hires are important. That's not what I meant to say. Staffing accordingly and staffing in an equitable way, I think is important. But activating that diversity, I think, is what's even more important, because what did I say in the book? I said diversity is being invited to the dance and inclusion is being asked to dance.
Right.
And I wish, I could have, I wish there was a more appropriate acronym that would have been SIDIE, or maybe 2 I's in there: servitude, innovation, inclusion, diversity, and empathy. But maybe we'll save that for another book. But there was a chapter in there about the power of inclusion. I wish it was a little bit longer.
Or maybe we can do inside and find a use for the N or something.
Hey, I'm into that.
All right.
You know what? Maybe they're in the
neurodiversity
edition of the book. Neurodiversity. So while you were saying that, Tim, an analogy that came to mind, or an anecdote that came to mind, was of a recent movie by Pixar, Soul. Great movie. And I remember watching the making of that movie, and Pete Docter, a white director with a mostly white cast, got to a point in the script's development where they said that we're not authentically capturing the experience of a Black jazz musician in New York City, in Harlem specifically, or wherever it was set. And so what they did was they turned to their diversity committee over at Pixar and they said, here's the problem we've run into. And they were open to feedback, and they got the feedback from the diversity committee. And then they restaffed accordingly to bring in a co-director, to bring in co-writers, to bring in Black perspectives that could breathe that spirit of authenticity into the movie. And what we got, hopefully, has been a more accurate representation of that story, of that community, than what was initially conceived by Pete. But that level of humility and recognition that maybe we're not the best people to take this forward is what's important. You think back to that infamous Kendall Jenner PepsiCo ad from a couple of years ago. That was the result of good intentions, right? When you think about why that happened because PepsiCo realized they were spending a lot of time and a lot of money with external agencies, that if they all consolidated that in-house, they'd be able to save time and money. And so they would rush to produce these things. But I forget who was the creative director behind that. The name eludes me right now. But again, I think it was a team of six white people that were trying to respond to something that was happening in the zeitgeist. And what you got is what you got. A very tone deaf, forgive my language, a very tone deaf ad that, is in the annals of history as one of the most infamously conceived and produced ads. Well, again, with the best of intentions. I don't think they were trying to offend, but this is what happens when you're not aware of your blind spots. And I think diversity and inclusion certainly helps to see what those blind spots are and take action to fill them.
And that reminds me of the point you raised in the book. It's not unique to you, but it's a good one to raise, in that not about us without us. The idea
nothing about us without us. Yeah.
Nothing about us. And this is where empathy comes in, but sometimes it also requires involvement. You can't hope to empathize with something that's completely outside your experience.
Yeah.
Have I done all of them? Oh no. So the final ingredient, or the final value in that list of 4, is innovation.
Yep.
And of course, you have to respond to all of these things. So you have the viewpoint of servitude, that you're going to be of service. You've empathized with people. You've got a diverse team to work with. Now the rubber has to meet the road. You have to produce something novel.
Oh man, I love that. The rubber has to meet the road. I'm first. So sorry. Go ahead, Tim. I was just going to.
No, that's it. So how does a leader make that happen?
I'll get into that, but this is awesome, right? The book is, at the time of recording this, the book has only been out for 100 or so days, and I'm still in the process of talking to people who have read the book, and whenever they're able to regurgitate the essence of the book in ways that surprise me, and they take different readings of it, it's the coolest thing as an author. So thank you so much, first of all, Tim.
Terrific. It's a great book.
Taking a sincere dive into this book and for inviting me to be a part of this. I listened to an episode of the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I've been listening to quite a few of them in preparation for this. One that stood out for me was The Innovation Delusion by Dr. Lee Vinsel, right? And early on in that podcast, you talk about Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma. And that's another book that I read in preparation for this. And I tried to, with every chapter, hone in on one story. And I think for the innovation story, I zoned in on Microsoft. That was my case study for this, focusing specifically on the reign of Steve Ballmer. And man, like, what a fascinating case study. I wish there were more books and movies written about this. How did this one guy nearly run the company into the ground over a 10-year span? Like, you inherited one of the most profitable, reputable companies in the world, and you went in there with the intention of doubling down on everything that was working. And in the process, you missed every major trend, and you lost your market share to Google, to Apple, to upstarts here, left, right, and center. And then one guy shows up at the end, Satya Nadella, and says, we got to hit reset. We got to reset the culture of this company, because this company has succumbed to a tyranny of now. They're so focused on today's customers that it's coming at the expense of solving for tomorrow's customers. So let's skate to where the proverbial puck is going to be, borrowing from a Wayne Gretzky quote, instead of focusing on where the puck is right now. We're not going to win this game. We're not going to win cloud computing. We're not going to win mobile. We're not going to win gaming, all of these things. Let's focus on where we need to be. And I think as of the time of recording, Microsoft has actually surpassed Apple as the most profitable company in the world. I think. I could be wrong, but I remember seeing a headline about that.
It sounds quite possible. I mean, certainly they've had a resurgence where I work.
A renaissance.
Yeah.
And this is at York, yeah?
That's right. Yeah. We've
Amazing.
invested heavily in their products.
There we go. Are you a fan of the centered start button now? On the Windows OS?
I haven't used is that Windows 11 that you're talking about?
I think that's Windows 11.
Yeah, my son is studying that intently right now, but I haven't played with it myself.
There we go.
I do miss the home button on my new iPhone.
I must say, it's
I'm getting used
interesting to see. It's interesting to see, like, the epoch that we're exiting from right now, where Apple was dominant with their designs. And now, you're starting to see Apple feel the heat from its rivals and see innovations that are happening with Samsung products and Microsoft products being like, oh, okay, we gotta step our game up over here. But this comes back to innovation, right? So if you've practiced and if you've operationalized and maximized servitude, fantastic. What happens is your people are prepared for the leadership moment. If you've operationalized and maximized diversity, you've unlocked the full gradient of your team. If you've operationalized and maximized empathy, you've operationalized your ability to anticipate when that moment of change comes. But as you said, Tim, when you operationalize and maximize the value of innovation, you engage in the process of self-disruption, and you're able to touch rubber to road successfully. You're able to land that plane because you can see the trend before it happens. You can see what companies will be spawned in the next few years that will take you out of business, and you can emulate them. You can reverse engineer the conditions for your failure and begin to avoid them strategically and maneuver in advance. You can conduct pre-mortems more effectively. But one of the chapters that I think about quite often in the book, there's two in particular. There's one about engineering chaos, and there's one about a skunkworks innovation division. This is something that I'm missing sorely. When I talk to, in all of my consulting and speaking with organizations, one of the questions I ask during the discovery is, do you have a dedicated innovation team? And I'm often surprised by how few of them do. And I'm talking about some of the top companies in the world. They call it an R&D department, but I'm not talking about an R&D department. I'm talking about a group of people who are tasked with two things. In the chaos engineering division, simulating the conditions like COVID-19, like a global pandemic that could take your company out of business. And I'm sure this is something that you do over at York, as director of computing over there, Tim. Like, I'm sure that some of the conversations you have with your team are about what could go wrong over here. What would go wrong if this server goes down, or if there's a hack? Like, you try to anticipate all of these scenarios. I don't think that happens enough in organizations. So I would love it if more organizations and leaders were able to create more exercises in which they stress test the capacity of their organization. And two, I wish there were more teams who were solely dedicated to imagining what sort of company could take you out.
Let me pick up on the theme of an innovation department for a minute.
Please.
There are pros and cons to that approach.
Totally. Yep.
You're basically saying that, or this is my interpretation, is you're charging one unit with the responsibility of finding the new ideas. And so they're going to go narrow and deep because you're not taking the whole organization with you.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And the other possibility is to go wide and shallow and say, okay, everybody needs to learn the skills of innovation. And it could be that it's like throwing a glass of water on the concrete. It doesn't, it just absorbs and it's gone. And so it doesn't actually take root. But the challenge with the skunk works, or the innovation department, is that the rest of the institution, the rest of the organization can strangle it in the crib. You can have, I don't know if you remember the Saturn division in GM.
Yes.
Right.
I read
it
about
started
that.
out being a completely different approach to car making and car selling and car marketing. And over time, it became just another division to the point that it lost relevance and got shut down.
Yeah.
So how do you avoid that kind of situation happening?
That's a great question. And I think, wow, you reminded me of the genesis of a team that I helmed at Ryerson University, an innovation division over there. And it was quite literally called the Innovation Unit. And we were skunkworks. We were essentially tasked with thinking up these bold new ideas and executing them. What happened is that it eventually changed and lost the innovation component. That in spirit, it was still there, but we became something more palatable to the rest of the organization. We became the storytelling unit. Now, in function, we still performed innovation duties, but we were much more baked into the larger operations. And I think that was a consideration made with regards to where we were at as an organization. I think the innovation unit served its function in terms of getting us and shocking the organization as a whole into a new way of thinking. Once we got into a new way of thinking, it just became part of our DNA. So yeah, maybe I do have a bias with my limited experience as a leader in different organizations to going small and deep, because maybe I haven't seen a successful example of going wide and shallow. I think a wide and shallow example that comes to mind for me is Pixar under Ed Catmull, where he talked about a culture of failure, where failure doesn't feel like falling on the concrete. It feels like falling on a bed of pillows.
Right.
Where it's encouraged. You're encouraged to fail and you're encouraged to fall down, and understand that it's not going to, count against you, that it's actually encouraged, that you're getting more information that'll help you to make better decisions moving forward. And you have a community that'll pick you back up. But that's Pixar. And I'm trying to think about some of your listeners right now who might be running small teams for whom the stakes are higher. They might be really tightly leveraged and they might not have the freedom to make bold decisions and absorb the failure. So I think for those organizations that don't necessarily have the permission space to go wide and shallow, maybe going small and deep is the answer. But yeah, what do you think, Tim? I'm curious to know, like, you run a pretty substantial department right now at York. And you've done quite a bit of consulting through your organization. I believe your organization is called Design Thinking Toronto. Design Thinking Toronto.
Thank you.
So what has been your experience with regards to this? These two ways of going about this: small and deep, or wide and shallow.
I think that the example of Pixar is actually a canny one, because the great thing about Pixar and any movie production facility is the projects have a clear start and end. Right. So if you're dealing with a situation where you are producing something and you're doing it outside the normal chain of command, and everybody can see the value of what's produced, that's terrific. I want to pick up on the theme of failure in general, because you've raised that, and of course you're a student of how people can lead, and if you're going to lead into areas that are unfamiliar, then you have to allow for failure. But I want to pick apart the term failure, because I feel like we're all over the map when it comes to failure. Failure is good because it helps us prevent failure in the future, because failure is bad, right? Really, I would sort of lean more towards not that failure is welcome, but experimentation is welcome. And the beauty of experimentation is you can't lose. Right. Either it does what you thought it was going to do, in which case you win, or it doesn't do what you thought it was going to do, in which case you've learned something.
Yeah, you either win or learn, right?
And so let me pick up on something else you mentioned earlier that I want to expand on. You talked about chaos and the chasm and the gap.
Yes.
And I want you to sort of frame that around notions of vision. You know, one of the great things about when you talk about that chasm and when you talk about the fog, it's being able to see through it. So talk about vision and the importance to leadership there.
This is good. And I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of the individual. I've been fascinated recently by, the downfall of certain leaders. And there was a whole section of the book that I had to cut. It was just too lengthy, but it was a really deep dive into Adam Newman of WeWork. I think I barely touched upon it in the final cut of Leadership Reinvented, but the initial chapter of Adam Newman was ginormous. I think it was big enough to be like, it was sizable enough to be like right there with the 4 SIDE chapters. Here's somebody that was suffering from optimism bias, right? This 10,000-year-old defense mechanism against adversity. It's this misbelief. It's the self-delusion that bad things only happen to other people, right? Mm-hmm. Like, Adam Newman probably thought that, Regis is going to fail and this, that company is going to fail, but not WeWork, not me. I can't fail. But here's the thing. Every organization is subject to the same 4 stages of growth, right? After a period of introduction, they grow, then they mature, and then the curve plateaus. And at the moment of plateau, an organization has to decide, will it renew itself and begin the curve anew? Or if it doesn't do that, it'll fall into the chasm of time. If you think about a curve, right? You think about success on the y-axis and you think about time on the x-axis. This is really where we're at. So Adam Newman, unfortunately, lost vision. I think that as he was, he thought that he was in the introduction phase for a lot longer than he was. He thought he was in the growth phase for a lot longer than he was. He thought that he wasn't in the maturity phase. And by the time they got to the renew or decline phase, it was already too late. The world around him had changed so much that he had lost control over how the organization could effectively respond to exogenous changes in the market. I don't think he had a good grip on the feelings of his people around issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, physical and psychological safety. And then by the end of it, he was just straight up delusional, lying, defrauding investors. I mean, that new documentary on Hulu is quite something. I think it should be mandatory viewing for people. The Rise and Fall of Adam Newman. So good. So vision is about getting real. Vision is about operationalizing and maximizing the values of servitude, innovation, diversity, and empathy, and trusting that what you're going to get, if you do this correctly, is an accurate read on the pulse of where your organization is currently situated in the zeitgeist. Are you relevant? Are you serving the needs of your customers? Are you future-proof? I guess a new consideration is, are you pandemic-proof? Are you chaos-proof? Can you withstand the forces of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, VUCA as an acronym? And that's what I think is going to be the biggest challenge for leaders coming out of the pandemic. I think a mistake if we come out of the pandemic is if we don't assume that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity are constant, that they will reemerge in different forms. They presented themselves in a very easily discernible way as a global pandemic, but make no mistake about it, these forces are leaving traces everywhere. We can feel it in workplace dynamics. We can feel it in tension between remote work and working from the office. We can get a sense of it in terms of the economy and just, our very globalized world and different systems failing. I was reading an article about how with the blockage that happened in the Suez Canal, or this, I don't know how to pronounce it, the Suez Canal, we're going to feel the ramifications of that for 15 years. It's going to take 15 years to undo some of the blockage that has happened in that 2 to 3 week span. All of this is to say, as a leader, come out of the pandemic assuming that the only constant is constant change. And once you can download that into your leadership repertoire, suddenly you're able to look at the world quite differently. You're not surprised whenever changes do happen. And Tim, you read the book, you know that at the end, I really gushed about Jacinda Ardern, and I shared that one anecdote of her doing an interview at the end of the book, where in the middle of the interview, a 5.8 magnitude earthquake goes off, and there's not a hint of fear in her eyes. She barely flinches, and the host says, "Ma'am, are you okay?" And she says, "I'm okay. I'm in a structurally sound place. I'm not under any hanging lights." Talk about somebody that doesn't have to get ready, that doesn't have to prepare, because she's always ready, always prepared. And I think there's some wisdom over there. If in moments of crisis, we don't rise to the occasion, we actually sink back to the level of our training and preparation, then what can we do in the months, the weeks, the years, the days, the minutes in advance of leadership moments to prepare ourselves to boot up a process that will help us during those moments of stress? That is, essentially what Leadership Reinvented is about. It's about reinventing yourself before you have to.
So there's a couple of themes in there that add more to what we were talking about earlier. So picking up on WeWork, I think of vision as being able to convince people, because if you want to make a change, my theory is it always gets worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what it is. If it's we're going to hire people for diversity, it's going to get worse before it gets better, because the diversity of thought that you want to engage is not going to emerge immediately. What you're going to get is the difficulty of connecting. But it's going to get worse, but it's going to get better. You build the Eiffel Tower. Traffic's going to be terrible for a few months, and then you're going to have the Eiffel Tower. People didn't even want the Eiffel Tower. They said it was hideous, and now it's like a big hit.
Yeah.
But it's about being able to say that journey is worth it. Right. That's vision. And so it's an interesting connection between what I was talking about, that there is no such thing as failure. It's only experimentation. There are occasions when you can't afford to experiment. It's do or die.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an interesting, because, with WeWork, for example, they had to grow to a certain point to dominate the marketplace, and it was do or die. They had to get there. What was it about WeWork that, you certainly talked about a lot of the hidden forces, the fact that it wasn't maybe a great place to work. That was part of it. But there's also a lot of criticism of the business model. Did it fall apart on the way into COVID, or was it already happening before COVID?
It was already happening before COVID, and maybe WeWork is not the best example, because right now we're still getting information about what actually happened over there, and it looks like there was just some criminality that was taking place. And I talk about that in the book a little bit, and I wish I dove into a little bit more of the dark triad of leadership, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. I might have another book project in me just focusing on those values based on my current academic research. But maybe a better example, Tim, would be Uber. I think Uber would be a more apt example when speaking about vision. So in order for Uber to exist, it needed a visionary like Travis Kalanick. He was the right guy for the job. Somebody brash, somebody who was willing to thumb their nose at convention, somebody who was willing to, partake fully in the hustle culture that defined the early 2010s. We needed Travis Kalanick to build Uber. Nobody else could have built it. But once Uber was introduced, once it grew, once it matured, Travis Kalanick was not the right guy to renew it. He didn't have the vision to take it past the very sort of frat culture, bro-y, hustle mentality company that was introduced. And you read in the book, I allude to, just some of the follies of Travis Kalanick. He was still behaving like the world was respecting of his style of leader. And it had moved on. Right. The world had moved on from there. And I think that disconnect was represented in that video that surfaced from an ABC report where he's arguing with one of his Uber drivers. And the disconnect was so, it was hideous. Obscene. It was obscene. It was obscene, right? It was hideous. Absolutely. And so the leader they have now, Dara Khosrowshahi, who came from Expedia, much more mature, much more level-headed, much more empathetic, somebody who practices the bright side values without even knowing what they are. And if he does, that would be awesome, right? Hey, Dara, if you're listening to this,
Yeah.
thank you for checking out the book, but I don't think you need to. You're already practicing the bright side values. Uber needed, in order to renew itself, somebody along the lines of Dara Khosrowshahi to reset the culture of Uber the way that Satya Nadella reset the culture of Microsoft. The tactics, the strategies that got you to the dance weren't the ones that were going to keep them there. Now, vision is interesting, right? Because Travis Kalanick, a very, very charismatic man, from what I understand, was able to galvanize that many people to get behind this idea of disrupting transportation. I don't know. I haven't watched many Dara Khosrowshahi interviews. I think he's charismatic. I think he's persuasive, but his challenge is going to be now convincing people, like you said, Tim, to get behind the vision. He needs to see far into the future and understand where the market's going to go and how to situate Uber to respond to where the market will be 5, 10, 20, 100 years from now, and convince people in the present to get behind that vision. And that's what that is. It's a part and parcel of being a leader, convincing people to go where you're going, where you think we should go together.
So swinging back a little bit to making diversity work and making sure that we understand one another, the Oxford Dictionary defines calling someone out as drawing critical attention to someone's unacceptable actions or behavior. You turn that around and suggest calling someone in. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I can think about times in my life where I've been called out, and I don't think I've ever responded well to it. I've always been embarrassed when I've been called out. I've always taken it, and maybe this is just a reflection of my personality, but it always felt like it was.
I think that we all feel that way. It's tough.
It feels disingenuous. It feels at times like virtue signaling on the other person's part. It feels like an opportunity for them to get a one-up on you. It feels combative, and I usually walk away from situations in which I'm called out, doubling down on my stance coming into that situation. It's not healthy for either party. However, I think back to one masterful instance of calling in that substantially changed my perspective on a lot. So I talk about it in the book, and I'll summarize it over here quickly. I was doing a talk to a group of women about how to become a public speaker. And at the end, I said something like, talk yourself into it, say you're an amazing speaker, and trust that, you'll be able to respond to that affirmation. And, the talk ended very well to applause. And I walked off stage, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, Hamza, I get what you were trying to say. And she was very respectful. She said, like, a great speech. Can I talk to you privately? Yeah, no problem. Okay. The thing you said at the end, just, for women, in my perspective, paraphrasing her, we need to overcome self-limiting beliefs to a higher degree than men typically do. We're much more harsh in terms of our self-talk, and we need to reaffirm that we are capable and deserve to be there, I would say 3 times more than you might. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. And I started to validate that concept with the women in my life, my partner, my sister, my mother, my coworkers, my friends. And I was like, wow, yeah, maybe the experience is the ground truth of a female burgeoning speaker are different than a male burgeoning speaker, that maybe they're walking into these spaces, on stages, on panels, in virtual settings, feeling imposter syndrome to a higher degree than men. And it made me much more sympathetic to that situation. And now I've changed my approach in terms of how I deliver feedback, how I encourage, women mentees and other speakers to step up, how I give them constructive feedback. Here's an example of calling in. Now, she could have done that at the end of the talk. She could have put her hand up and said, hold on, Hamza, let me interrupt you for a second, but you're wrong. And just imagine me standing up in front of that audience being like, okay, all right. Like, it would have just been a grand undermining of me in that moment. But the way she did it, I feel it is permanent. Mm-hmm. And is memorable. The fact that we're talking about it, the fact that I've committed it as a story to this book, I think speaks to the efficacy of calling in versus calling out. What do you think, Tim?
Well, it certainly beats the talking point that you're mansplaining, right? It gives you a chance to really internalize it and think it through and come to the other person's side. The question it brings to mind, though, is even the idea of what's the word that you use? Imposter syndrome.
Imposter syndrome, yeah.
Is not unique to women. It may be a greater degree for women, but what's interesting is that you don't know who you're talking to and what's going through their head, right? And so sometimes this idea you should just pull yourself by your bootstraps, we know that doesn't always resonate. That's what Bell Mental Health, what is it, month is about. It's this idea that sometimes you can't just talk yourself into things, that you actually need help. So do you think it's possible to sort of calibrate the advice you would give generally in a way that could be accepted by everyone? Or is it really just, you sort of have to say, this is going to work for, the people between these goalposts. And if you feel like it's not resonating, then maybe we can have a private conversation, or maybe I'm not the right speaker for you.
Yeah. And let me get even more, focused here with the topic of leadership, right? I have a couple of direct reports right now. The way I lead each of them is different than when I lead the whole. When I lead the whole, I'm very delicate and I string together themes that have emerged from my one-on-ones with them. I think I would be an ineffective leader if I gave them a one-size-fits-all mandate, if I tried to lead them in the same way. Each of these people are unique. They have their own backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives, their own nuances that make them tick, their own motivations, unique personalities. It's hard work. It would be a lot easier for me and you, Tim, to stand up in front of our teams and be like, this is the way, follow this. This is the process. This is the software we use, get on board. But we have to engage in the process of getting them to voluntarily get behind us. And that's where the shift in leadership, if we want to distill it down to one word, an operational word, the shift of the last 20 years of leadership styles, it is increasingly now about that which elicits voluntary followership. Mm-hmm. Command and control, dictating and delegating without second thought, all of these styles and all of these sort of avoidant, aggressive, and authoritarian manifestations of leadership that are characterized quite well by Douglas McGregor's theory X style of management are passé increasingly, day by day. I mean, we're seeing an example right now with Apple, where Apple is trying to mandate a return to the office. They're saying Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays, you have to be in the office. And you have, I think now 3,000 employees across the organization writing an open letter to Tim Cook being like, what the hell? Like, this is, first of all, going against the values of becoming, carbon neutral by 20, whatever their goal is. Not only are we as productive working from home, we're more productive. What this mandate is saying is that you don't trust us. Yeah. This mandate is saying that you don't respect our ability to work from home and you're not setting healthy boundaries over here. So, if you want to get people on board, this decision needs to be made in consultation with the people that you serve. I think that this decision might have been made prematurely by Apple. They might have done this in consult with just managers and not having checked in and not read the pulse of the inside of the organization or the outside. So this is an example of a misstep that Apple might be engaging in. Now, if we want to get into, is this Apple's way of thinning the herd?
Right.
Are there potentially some nefarious forces in the upper echelons of Apple? Is there subclinical versions of Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism that are being weaponized? And is the work from home being used as a way to excise the company of certain employees? I don't know. Maybe that's a subject for another book, another podcast. Who knows?
Okay, so that's a provocative notion. The reason I'm not inclined to think that way is I don't see the relationship between the people who are willing to trudge into work and who are doing the best work. So why would you use that mechanism to thin the herd?
Now that you say that, yeah, you're right.
I think it has more to do with, we just spent $1 billion on this shiny circle in the middle of a forest.
yeah.
Right.
So one, what is it called? One way, one hacker way or something. No, that's
something like that. Yeah. I think it has something to do with that.
Yeah. But yeah, maybe that's what it is. Sunk cost fallacy, right? We spent all this money on this thing. Let's use it.
I want to pick up on, I'm going to bounce around a little bit because you're raising themes that are
this is fun, man.
For me too. This is from your TED talk called, no, which one do I want? I want Stop Managing, Start Leading.
Start Leading, boom.
So, or which one is it? Anyway, I'll
There's
just
the burnout one too.
freeform
So
it. I'll
go for
freeform it. So, you talk about a manager who expected you to be at your desk at a certain time and was more fixated on that than the quality of your work.
Right.
And I shared this Twitter post with you. I retweeted somebody by the name of Shower Thoughts. And he tweeted that, and this is quoting him or her, "You aren't paid according to how hard you work. You are paid according to how hard you are to replace." And I don't think that's true universally. I think sometimes it's a lot easier to see how hard you're working than it is to really understand the value you're producing. And so for a lot of managers who find themselves unwilling or unable or just not able to conjure up the time to really assess how people are doing, at least seeing them at their desk is important. At least seeing them, and you don't like it, well, we're paying you. So that takes the sting out of it. That's what the money's for, to misquote Don Draper. So the COVID, we've spent about a year of an experiment with a lot of white collar workers working from home.
Right.
And it was like a tsunami, but that's like the water getting sucked out.
Right.
And you know what happens? There's always the water gets sucked back in.
The flow, right? Ebbs and flows. Yeah.
And so everybody's going to be back to work, or at least a large proportion, but it's going to take a while for the new shoreline to emerge. The water's going to slosh.
Beautifully said, Tim. That's a great analogy. I'm going to borrow that and quote you on it.
Excellent. I'm happy to hear that. So, where do you think the balance of power sits between like organizations and individuals now? Because I see a lot of cross currents there, right? On the one hand, we don't have to necessarily drive into work. On the other hand, they can get somebody from anywhere in the world to do your job. On the other hand, I can get a job anywhere in the world. So where do you think things are going to settle out? Do you think we're better off as individuals now, or is it possibly worse?
I suspect, and this is informed by reading many a white paper from many think tank, the Future Skills Center, Deloitte, McKinsey, PwC, you name it. I mean, reading World Economic Forum briefings, all of that. The sense that I get is that we are moving to a future in which individuals will act as freelancers. They will be hired guns. They will do tours of duty at different organizations and not necessarily be employees. They will be people like you and I who have portfolios of work, right? So I know, you're working at York University as in a senior position as an executive, but that's just one element of what you do, right? Tim Hampton is a brand beyond that. Tim Hampton is also a consultant, a founder, an entrepreneur, a podcast host, a thought leader, so on and so forth. I mean, you have a channel that I want to ask you about, Lead Like Elon. I'm like, what's that and where is that going, right? I'm in the same boat as well, right? To define me as just an author would be doing me a disservice. That's not all I am. I'm so much more than that. So I think this is the direction that we're heading in. People will form portfolios of work. Now, I do think that the trend is tending to, or I do think where we are, at least generationally, understanding my generation of millennials, and then understanding the zeitgeist, or attempting to understand the zeitgeist for the generation after us. I think tomorrow's leaders will be less focused on outputs and more focused on outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Yeah.
I think it was important for my boss and our generational divide being a big part of that, in that story that I shared in my TEDx talk, to see me at my desk. Because the truth is, looking back, my objectives and key results were poorly defined. They weren't even defined to begin with. My output was my time in the office, the optics of it, and how well I, kissed ass, if you will. How well I appear to be a company man, saying the right things, but very little attention was paid to the deliverables. And once it cued in for me that there's nothing about my deliverables that has any impact on my success over here, and if I'm not being treated respectfully, Here's an organization that describes itself as a family, but is treating me very much like a second-class citizen, like a prisoner. Now, then this goes both ways. If you're not going to respect me as an individual, I'm not going to respect you. So I'll play your game. I'll show up. You're going to get everything that you want, but I'm going to get everything I want too. And, that relationship devolved. It became toxic by the end, and we both exited the company. Now,
yeah,
it gives me
it's
great
very
satisfaction
corrosive
to say that company doesn't exist anymore. So.
Well, it's very corrosive when you find yourself doing the minimum too, especially, you have outed yourself. You have identified as an overachiever, at least at one point. You're recovering.
Recovering now.
But you're somebody who takes pride in your achievements, and to find yourself in a situation where your OKR is he's at his desk for 7 hours a day.
Oh God.
That's it's not a great feeling. I can
It's
imagine.
not a great feeling. And there's something that I've learned about recently called bore out, which is the opposite end of the Yerkes-Dodson curve. On the far side of it, on the right side, on the x-axis, you've got performance, and on the y-axis, you've got a y-axis performance, x-axis difficulty. If the level of difficulty is too high, then your performance is low, and if the level of difficulty is too low, then your performance is just as low. And on opposite ends of that curve, where the difficulty is too low beyond performance, where you're overworked, that's burnout, and when you're underworked, that's bore out. Which, interestingly enough, Tim, presents the same physical symptoms. So it is a form of burnout. You can be so bored that you get burned out. It's fascinating to me. I thought that this was, something that was relegated to overachievers and high performers like you and I. But, if there are any slackers listening to this, know that you are at risk of burning out. You're in trouble, man. Yeah.
So, okay, let's talk about OKRs. I was a bit surprised that you raised Jack Welch as a source of quotes. The quote you used, of course, is a good one. This idea that if the world is changing faster than you are, you're in trouble. I completely agree. But he's also Neutron Jack, the guy who would annually get rid of 10% of his executives.
Yep.
It was like a ritual beheading.
Culling.
Or, and it was based on, probably some pretty straightforward metrics. How much money are you making? Actually, I think it was more along the lines of, are you in the top 3 of your industry? If you're not, you're out.
Yeah.
And reconcile that for me. Is the quote an exception, or do you see that there was some wisdom to the way he was approaching it, or was it only appropriate then?
I thought about this a lot, right? In the initial iteration of the book, I used a variation on that idea by Indra Nooyi, the CEO of Pepsico. Unfortunately, she didn't say it in the eloquent way that I was hoping she would have articulated it, because that would have made it into the book. So for the sake of, theatricality and writing a punchy book, I went with Jack Welch, but also because I wanted to show that this is a company that has reinvented itself so many times that it's unrecognizable from its first iteration. GE today, make no mistake about it, is a big data company. It's not a utility, right? I mean, it certainly has elements of
it's a mortgage company that makes jet engines too.
Yeah, well said. Well said. So that was interesting, right? Neutron Jack. I've been meditating on this idea that not every. Okay, how much time do we have, Tim? Can I go a little deep on this one?
Yeah, go for it. Take me with you.
So I'm engaged in graduate research right now that is examining the link between occupational burnout and leadership. Mm-hmm. And what I'm doing is I'm studying a cross-section of Canadian companies. I'm looking at the top 100 companies in Canada as determined by the Globe and Mail, and I'm looking at the bottom 100 companies by their Glassdoor ratings. And what I'm doing is I'm aggregating a bunch of reviews sorted by helpfulness from Indeed, from Glassdoor, from Blind, for all of these companies. And I've put them together to try and understand what are the, how prevalent are the preconditions for burnout at all of these organizations. So what I found, first of all, and I'm still very, very nascent in this research over here, but some early findings are fascinating. The first thing is that the preconditions for burnout exist in equal measure across all of these companies, across the top companies and the lowest companies. So just because you work at a bad company, it doesn't mean that you are more likely to burn out. You are probably just as likely to burn out at a top company, which is fascinating.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that some of these companies that are positioned as top companies, they're lying when it comes to their mission, vision, values. You go to their wellness pages, you go to their benefits, they're saying things like, we care about our people, we're a people first company, your safety is really important to us. But then you look and you dive deeper into the metrics and you're like, wow, the same preconditions exist here. People are being overworked, they're not being respected, there's a lack of fairness, they're not feeling control over their workload, et cetera, et cetera. Now, here's what's really interesting to me is that some companies and this is happening on both ends of the spectrum, some of the best places to work and some of the worst places to work, some of the places where burnout is endemic and some of the places where burnout is minimal, they're not even trying to position themselves as a place to thrive as a human being. I'm not going to name the company right now, but there's a company that is hiding in plain sight. And they say on their website that we're an opportunity, we're not a career. This is a place where you come to test yourself. You're going to be outside of your comfort zone at this company. I will mention who they are when I publish this research, but I found that to be really fascinating. This is a company where the leader has said, if you burn out here, it's expected.
Okay. I do want to pull on that thread a lot. I know you wanted to go deep, but I want to interrupt just a little bit because.
Okay, sorry, go for it, Tim.
Because you raised my other podcast, Lead Like Elon. And the reason I am such a fan of Elon Musk is I think it's hard to argue there isn't somebody who hasn't made a decision to change the world and done so with so much impact as him. Like to me, he's singular.
Yeah. Alien.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I'd rush to be his executive assistant.
I see what you're saying. I see where you're getting to. Yeah.
And I think that there were a few things you said earlier. One of them was that you can't sort of get up and say the same thing to your entire team and expect it to land with everyone equivalently. But I think you may have, or maybe I imagined you mentioned like almost a Darwinian aspect to it. And I think this is the way Elon Musk manages. First of all, everybody knows that that's the show. Working for SpaceX or Tesla, you are changing the world. A lot of people would sign up for that, not for the money, but for the fact that it's making an important improvement to the world.
Right. You're not trying to get the Centennial Award
challenge,
yeah.
Right? But it's also brutal working conditions.
Yep.
Because when Elon Musk makes a vision, it's across a chasm that very few other people would attempt.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So you're all evil Knievel right now, holding onto this car and trying to make sure that it'll get across. And if it doesn't, we're all doomed. Right. And so it's almost like, the old ships with the oars in the water, and he's at the back cracking the whip because that's the only way we're going to make it.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And
the vision is so bold that it's hard for people.
It has to be like that.
Hard for people to see it.
And so, in that respect, he's kind of like Jack Welch. It may not be as focused on money. I think that's an important difference, because I think Jack was all about, well, if we can make money doing mortgages, let's do that. That had nothing to do with General Electric, but let's do it. Right. We got money, we can lend it out.
Yep.
Whereas Elon Musk is like, are we getting to Mars? Are we stopping the consumption of oil? Anyway, so I just wanted to sort of connect those things. Do you have any thoughts on what's going on at SpaceX and Tesla? Do you have any misgivings?
I do have some thoughts about that. I do think that there are some companies that are certainly opportunities. I would say that working at Tesla is one of them. Working at Amazon is one of them. Blue Origin, one of them. SpaceX, one of them, for sure. These are places where if you're going in, you got to understand that the price of admission is stress, that you're not going in you're not joining these companies to have a balanced work-life balance. If you're joining these companies thinking, okay, I'm going to be here and I'm going to work 40 to 50 hours a week, it's not the place for you, man.
No.
There's other companies where you can do that and it's fine. And it's not a knock on you. Not everybody has to be a visionary or a disruptor like that. You can have an impact with the company you're at in your own way. So that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that Elon Musk is a good leader. It might be an effective leader, but an effective leader within a specific context. But if you look again, history will tell. We're going to see how the story plays out over time. If I suppose the definition I implied of organizational success in Leadership Reinvented was an organization's ability to traverse the chasm of time. So I've equated longevity of an organization with organizational success. That's debatable. I can understand some people might say that maybe the goal isn't to live forever. It's not to be here for a long time, but to be here for a good time. And that's fine. Maybe that's another book that can be written.
Yeah.
But I think I don't want to say most people would agree, but I think it's conventional or widespread understanding that if an organization is able to stand the test of time and succeed over a sustained period and continuously grow and serve people in a meaningful way, that's good. And I gave the example of the 2019 Business Roundtable, where you had the likes of Salesforce, Apple, Walmart, et cetera, come together and say that the organization needs to go beyond delivering shareholder value and focus on creating value at all levels with individuals, with people inside the company, outside of the communities, outside of the company and local communities and the environment. This gives me great joy to know that there is a version of our future in which we can hit the reset button on the role of the corporation in society and create more equitable results for all people. That gives me a lot of hope to see organizations now move in that direction. But there are outliers, and Amazon is an outlier. SpaceX and Tesla are outliers. And I think what we're going to see increasingly when, this comes back to this analogy that you gave, a beautiful one about the ebbs and flows, and try to find out where the shoreline is. I think this tug of war is going to continue to happen. But I do believe that for the last 20 years, at least, we have been moving more in the direction of doing the right thing for the most amount of people.
I hope you're right. I like that.
I hope so, man. I hope so.
What I want to do next, I'm all over the map, and I want to talk a little bit more about your two exceptionally popular and well-regarded TEDx talks.
Thank you.
But I want to talk about being an author.
Sure.
Once you decided to write Leadership Reinvented, what was your first step? Did you say, did you find a publisher? Did you start writing? What were the steps that you took?
Yeah, there were two things that happened around the same time. So I had been working on a manuscript. I have at any given time several different book projects in the works, but they're not framed or articulated as book projects. They're just collections of notes and stories that I put together in different buckets, some in Medium, some in my notes, some in email, some in Google Docs. There's just a set of ideas, a jumble of ideas that exist. So I wait for the inspiration to strike, and the inspiration struck with an event at the beginning of the pandemic. And at the same time, I was being courted by a publisher based in California that has a really interesting approach to publishing. What they do is they study bestsellers and they look at different big data trends across e-commerce. And they try to find out what elements in books are hot and which ones will be hot from a search engine optimization perspective. So they came to me with a model. They said, Hamza, based on your TEDx talk, do you have a book idea in you that could meet the following criteria? Could it speak to the future of leadership? Could it speak to the future of work? Could it speak to these themes, servitude, et cetera, diversity? They gave me a keyword cloud. And I sat with the keyword cloud for a while, and I was like, I agree with some of this. I don't agree with all of it. So we began a negotiation process with the publisher. And I said, I like what the data is telling me. The data is telling me that there's a real appetite from readers to understand a better way to lead moving forward. But from my perspective, this data is missing the context that could be introduced by, X, Y, and Z. And I presented them with a counter proposal. We met halfway and we were off to the races. What we did then, Tim, was we created some constraints. We said that we need to have the manuscript shipped in a couple of months. It was a very short writing camp for me. Wow. I was able to crank out the entire book in 3 months, start amazing. To finish. But again, I had the advantage of time and space. And
you also had been ruminating on the subject for a long time.
I had been ruminating on the subject for a long time. And a secret for any aspiring writers out there, you got to stay in the habit. I have a habit of everyday writing, and most of that writing goes into drafts, but I just write. I just keep that muscle active. So when it came time to writing, it was just easy for me to flow and for me to convert those ideas to paper. Thank God, though, I had a team this time. When I published my first book, The Burnout Gamble, it was just myself, a researcher, and an editor that I had contracted. And I was simultaneously the author, the editor, the marketer. I was everything. And, I talk about an ironic title, The Burnout Gamble. I took a gamble with publishing that book and nearly burned out in the process.
Well, I got to stop you just for a second.
Yeah.
You know Tim Ferriss?
Tim Ferriss, the 4-Hour Workweek. Yeah.
Yeah. How many hours does that guy really work?
Oh man, it's a lie.
It's ridiculous.
Don't even get me started on Tim Ferriss, man.
Yeah.
That paradigm, it's frustrating because that book was so instrumental in my evolution as a professional and my way of thinking and working. But the more I've learned about the 4-Hour Workweek and the more I've come to understand some of the critical issues that underpin equity, diversity, inclusion, and privilege, I'm like, man, that book could have only been published by Tim Ferriss at that particular time in the zeitgeist, not any time now. But let me come back to Leadership Reinvented real quick and close this off. With Leadership Reinvented, I was very fortunate with this publisher to have their resources at my disposal. They gave me 3 to 4 editors. They took care of all the marketing. What they allowed me to do, Tim, was just truly bask in the subject matter and just write. And it was so much fun. I miss it. I miss that process of waking up every day and just looking out at my calendar and thinking to myself, oh, wow, the only thing I have to do today is watch this movie called Downfall about the last 48 hours of Hitler's life and try to understand how, the manifestations of the dark triad present themselves in a historical figure. And I was like, fuck, man, this is great, man. I wish I could do this forever and ever. But this is the curse, right? When we get so deep in this one way of thinking, we use only one side of our brain, then, as restless people who have multiple things on the go, just like you do, we want to bounce back and strike an equilibrium. So I'm glad that was a very short writing camp. I was able to crank out the manuscript and get back to business. And, it was inspiring for me because in writing that book, I was able to validate some of my practices, but also identify some blind spots, many blind spots in my leadership. And what I've been endeavoring to do since writing the book and publishing it is try to live out the book. I have a great friend. His name is Zachar Hemraj, someone great to interview, by the way. He's the CEO of Lupio. I'd love to make the introduction. One of the most eloquent speakers, such a deep thinker. What a great guy. He said to me, sometimes before you write the book, you have to become the book. And with the case of Leadership Reinvented, I was only half of the book before I wrote it. So I wrote the book and I'm now trying to become the other half of it.
Well, it is fascinating. The expression when one teaches to learn.
To learn, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you're going to put something, you might have the thoughts in your head and be able to just sort of convey them conversationally. But when you try to put it to paper, you got to back it up, you got to scaffold it, and you discover, oh yeah, there are some gaps there.
Tim, between the two of us, man. And when I say between the two of us, I'm really speaking to your hundreds and thousands of listeners, right? One of the things I was told by my publisher that I absolutely could not speak about in the book was the political climate of the day. And I wrote this book in 2020, and it's been published in 2021. And in 2020, of course, we were seeing a manifestation of dark triad leadership failed before our eyes. Talk about if there was only one case study I could give you and scrap everything else, it would be that of the former US president. But I was told that introducing this into the book would make it very time bound, but it would also alienate a lot of potential readers.
Yeah.
And it would be very decisive.
In a world where winning means 51%.
Yes, sir. Wow. Well said. In a world where winning means 51%.
And you've lost 49% of your potential book sales. Poof.
And let me tell you, Tim, this book has now ended up in the hands of some people that I never thought it would end up in. Like I got a bulk order the other day from a police department in the United States that's making this book mandatory reading material to become a police captain. And I was like, wow.
What an enormous impact.
Enormous impact. But imagine if I spent half the book excoriating the former president. Yeah. I mean, it just would have been in poor taste. I would have only done it because it was in vogue to do. There's no part of me that enjoys the downfall of other people. There's no part of me that enjoys lacerating them in the book. Like even when I spoke about Travis Kalanick and Adam Newman and Elizabeth Holmes, I tried to do so in a delicate way and try to be as empathetic as possible because, at the end of the day, these are people who might have had their own trauma that they've had to overcome, their own demons that they were battling that made them dip into that reservoir that is the dark triad of leadership. I don't think anybody is born, I'm a newly minted uncle. When I look at this baby that my sister has given birth to, I'm like, wow, this is such a pure thing. It's a ball of potential that has no ideas, no notion of morality. It's just there, right? But it's the nurture over time that causes people like Elizabeth Holmes to become the monster that she eventually became. I forgot where I was going with this, but
let me.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. You got it back.
I think I slightly got it back, and I'll end it quickly before I lose it. That was a process of writing this book. The process of writing this book entailed, having these editors tell me not to be as verbose as I was becoming. And I'm aware that I'm becoming a little more verbose on this podcast in real time, but they kept me in check, and they were the constant reminders throughout this writing process to write not just for self-indulgence, but to write for the audience, to write for utility, to write for instruction. This book, compared to my first book, it's shorter, it's much more clear, it's concise, and it's more focused on the actionable insights. Less time is spent on exposition, and we go right into the actionable insights. So it's lacking some of the finesse of my first book. It's lacking some of my, waxing poetic and my eloquence, but I'm okay with that, because I think the readers have spoken, and they've said that this book is something that is so timely and relevant. And I'm glad that this book was published when it was published with the publisher that I published it with, because if left to my own devices, I would have taken forever to write it.
Well, yeah, for sure. Having you could say that was like a coach, but I haven't read your first book, but I suspect it was a lot more personal.
A lot more personal.
About a situation that you had suffered from.
Yes, sir. And in addition to that, it was written at a time when I lacked the, wow, I wish I could rewrite that book. And this is motivation, because the book is still relevant in terms of its strategies to help the individual beat burnout and build resilience. But my understanding of burnout as a phenomenon has changed in the last 7 years, where I'm now convinced, and I'm going to wait to say this, and we'll do this podcast again. I'd love to have you on my podcast as well. I'm doing the research now that is going to validate the point that burnout is has the responsibility for beating burnout has been unfairly downloaded to the individual. And that's not what leaders are willing to hear right now. Leaders do not want to hear that the onus is on the individual to take care of their well-being and beat burnout and build resilience. When in fact, the evidence is showing, the early research is showing that the primary cause of burnout is the workplace culture and is the leader. That was my drum roll. I should have actually just hit over.
Well, let me pick up on that, because I did have a question about that.
Okay.
I haven't read the Burnout Gamble. I apologize, but I have watched the TEDx talk with the same title, and it reminded me of a friend of mine. This is, a long time ago. He had an old Toyota, manual transmission, no tachometer, and he drove it hard. And he knew when he was hitting redline, when there's a distinctive sound an overhead cam engine will make when the valves start to float. It's not good for the engine, and you can hear it, and you're like, okay, I got to back off. Now, I use that as an analogy for kind of what you're proposing to people who wish to achieve a lot without burning out. And that is to get in touch with some critical things you'll notice in yourself that say, okay, my valves are starting to float.
Yes.
Can you talk about that, and what is, and I imagine it's a personal thing for you. It was like, when I'm at stage 3, that's enough. Can you talk about that?
I'm still doing some research into this, into the preconditions of burnout and how burnout presents physically. But I've been thinking about this idea that our body has a set of diagnostic displays. Your nervous system is the best one that you can think about, that gives you some very clear indicators that things are not working. You're having disrupted eating patterns, you're not sleeping well, you're having irritable bowel syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. These are all your body's way of telling you that something's wrong, something's broken. Please stop, please fix this before things go awry. Now, what happened for me in the lead up to my last burnout episode in 2014 was I was ignoring those symptoms and I was pushing past them and I was dismissing them as other things. I was unable to separate normal stress and normal physiological responses to things in my environment. And I was saying that this can't be about stress. This can't be about burnout. I mean, so what if I'm only drinking Red Bull and drinking coffee all day and not sleeping? Why, that's not the thing that's affecting my sleep. Surely that's not it.
No,
The
it
reason
couldn't
why
be.
the reason why my skin is breaking out has nothing to do with stress. It has to be with this cream that I bought. Maybe I got to switch out my lotion. Or, maybe the reason why I'm bleary-eyed has nothing to do with the fact that I'm staring at a screen for so long. Maybe it's because of the weed that I'm smoking or whatever, right? Whatever the case may be, I was lying to myself in the lead up to that burnout episode. And by the time I cued into the realization that maybe I'm falling out of balance, I'm maybe, tipping over, it was far too late. By the time you become self-aware that you're burning out, it's usually months, if not years later. So I'm lucky that it happened when it did, because if it didn't happen, I first of all wouldn't have the career that I have right now. I didn't set out to become a burnout speaker, expert, all of these things. I'm still very much a marketer at heart. I'm a communicator. I'm somebody who enjoys writing, but the thing that happened to me has given me the opportunity to speak about burnout. Now, I mean, thinking about your friends Tacoma, your friends Tacometer
Toyota,
and the
yeah.
Toyota over there, right?
Yeah.
You got to pay attention to those signs. You have to become in touch with your body. There's some very clear indicators that you're burning out. Some very clear indicators that stress is getting the best of you. But people have a tendency to dismiss them. And it comes back to the thing that I described when speaking about Adam Newman. It's optimism bias. We have this false belief that bad things only happen to other people. When, I ask people all the time, when was the last time you burned out? Most people are honest and they'll say, I burned out today or last week, last month. Every now and then you're going to get some people being like, I never burned out. I didn't burn out. But then you dive deeper and you're like, yeah, you did, man. Like you definitely did burn out, but you're calling it something else. You're saying that, I had that 1 year where I went through a divorce and, I lost my job and I wasn't sleeping well, but that was just stress. And it's like, no, actually it's not. Because if you look at the Holmes and Ross stress index, if you score higher than 300 in a calendar year, you're actually presenting physical symptoms that would indicate that you've burnt out. But maybe you have some resilience or some coping mechanism, some self-talk that is taking you outside of that. Maybe there's some stigma attached to it. And I get it, because when I burned out, the last thing I wanted to do was face the people that I had disappointed and let down during my burnout. I felt like a complete failure because Tim, like you, I a lot of my identity is tied up in what I do. Like you are an effective executive, you are an effective leader, an effective consultant, an effective podcast host. And if one of those things were to be not true, you might internalize that as, hey, maybe Tim Hampton is not good at what he does.
Not who I thought I was going to be. Yeah.
And that sucks. No one wants to feel that way. So I understand the stigma around burnout. But I'm trying my very best with any audience and anyone who listens to me to let people know that the reason why you're burning out doesn't actually have a lot to do with you. That there are factors that are preheating people as a whole for burnout. There's factors mostly outside of our control: global competition, increasing alienation in the fourth industrial revolution, societal messages pressuring us into feeling like we're not enough, toxic positivity, toxic productivity anytime you log onto social media. Then there's technology, then there's loneliness, then there's the economy. All of those things, and then you enter into a workplace where you have toxic leadership in the form of dark triad leaders. And what did Christina Maslach say? Christina Maslach is considered to be one of the pioneers of burnout. She said that no matter how beautiful the plant is, no matter how many flowers, no matter how many green leaves, if you stick it in the dark, if you put it in bad soil, it is going to fail. It is going to die. The environment has everything to do with why people are burning out. I mean, not everything, but it has more than we've been led on to believe. And here's the kicker, Tim. As part of my research, I'm looking at the growth of the well-being, self-care, and personal development industries in the last decade. And my goodness, have they exploded. Pharmaceutical sales, self-help books, downloads of podcasts, ebooks, apps, etc. The awareness of what the individual can do has increased, and the adoption of practices have increased. People are eating healthy. I mean, people are are aware of how to eat healthier. They're aware of the popular literature on, sleeping better, setting boundaries. I mean, what was the most popular book last year at self-help? The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, right? All of these things are there. And you would assume that based on a rise in the last 10 years, that global rates of stress and burnout would decrease as a result. But they haven't. They've exponentially increased. And the reason they've increased exponentially, Tim, you're going to get an exclusive here for your listeners. Because
bring it.
Based on my early research, the responsibility for beating burnout and building resilience has been unfairly downloaded to the individual, when in fact the problem exists at the management, leadership, and culture level. And there's a recent Microsoft study that has illuminated this, and it came and it went. And I grabbed it and I bookmarked it and I said, I'm going to pick back up on this. A survey that Microsoft conducted about how people felt during the pandemic. Management and above have been thriving. Management and below, languishing, exhausted, tired, stressed, overwhelmed. What does that say about the current state of affairs?
Okay, there's a whole lot there, and I've already kept you so long.
Hey man, I'm hanging, man.
I'm grateful for the time, and we're getting close to what was going to be my last question, but I have to ask you a little bit about that, because this idea that the resolution of burnout is downloaded to the individual. We are living in a time where there's a lot of forces that are trying to download everything to the individual.
Yep.
So that's one theme. But before we leave the other theme, I kind of feel like we are the only animal that is born unable to function. There's another gestation period.
Yeah.
Right.
That's so funny, man. Like giraffes are born and they just start running.
Exactly.
And humans, hey man, I was at home until I was 18 plus.
Exactly. And so we have, and I think that this is like a third gestation, is the self-help.
Yeah.
That we can, the time after we're born, we're exceeding our biology, and the time after we leave home, we're exceeding our culture.
Ooh, well said.
So I can see why there's a lot of interest in self-help books and self-development and so on, because it's a chance to kind of unshackle yourself from the lessons you've learned from the people around you.
Right. And to acclimatize yourself to a bigger world.
Yeah. But coming back to the thing about everything being downloaded to the individual, it is a peculiar thing to me that we've constructed a culture almost worldwide where everybody's nervous. Everybody's afraid of falling behind.
Yes.
Jeff and Elon are constantly trading places, and I'm sure they're very upset about it.
Yep.
And how does that make us feel at the other end of the spectrum? I mean, like we're somewhere in the middle. We're fortunate people, but that could be taken. It feels like it could be taken away in a heartbeat. There could be COVID. There could be an earthquake. There could be this. There could be that. And so I think that's part of what's underlying this need to achieve. It's not just the intrinsic result of contributing to this world and getting esteem, not only self-esteem, but esteem from others for doing that. It's also feathering the nest and building a protection, a bulwark against things we are no longer protected against by society.
Wow.
And it's peculiar to me that we live, Reagan and Thatcher kind of said, screw your unions, we're going to be productive now.
Yep.
And it was a sensible strategy in the 70s and 80s because we were not very productive. Now we've discovered we can have 30% of the population sitting at home and still be tremendously productive. Amazon still comes. I mean, there's supply chain troubles, but we've all eaten, we've all driven cars. Well, not all of us can afford it. You know what I mean? Like,
I get it. Yeah.
The median is still okay. There's still enough stuff. It's just the money's all at one end of the pool.
Oh, wow.
And so I wonder if the work you're doing to help people sort of address with or deal with the tensions in life, you use the word zeitgeist. I think that the zeitgeist right now is we've been tricked into voting for policies that are against the individual, or more to the point, that result in everything being the responsibility of the individual.
It's all connected, Tim. It truly is. Maybe, just maybe, my research is trying to reposition or trying, or is a keyhole rather into understanding where we are in terms of the evolution of capitalism. Maybe this is a question of late stage capitalism, right? I think about the William Butler Yeats poem, turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold.
Right.
I think like the bottom has fallen out. We have lost the certainty of so many things. We've lost the certainty of the dollar. We've lost the certainty of government. We've lost the certainty of, if I dare say, even the function that religion played once upon a time.
Sure.
And we're looking for answers. We're looking for the definition of enough, of self-value in everything other than ourselves. I love that you brought up Mad Men, right? What is Mad Men other than a reflection of what has taken the place of God, essentially? What has taken the place of the individual believing that they're enough? You have these ad men like Don Draper going into boardrooms and figuring out how to scratch the itch of not feeling perfect enough, efficient enough, progressive enough, satisfied enough, or innovative enough. Instead of you digging deep and saying that, what I have, me, my family, my health, my wellness, my life in this country, that's good enough. You have someone like Don Draper say, actually, you need a new phone.
Right.
So
the commercialism, yeah.
And this is the scary thing, because when you think about that Charlie Chaplin movie, I forget, oh my goodness, I can't remember what it was. Geez. But Metropolis, the final scene, well, one of the scenes comes to mind where they're just feeding the machine, feeding the beast. I mean, that to me represents a typical organization today. The reason why we have the 40-hour work week, it was arbitrary. We had the 40-hour work week because we wanted to split up our day into thirds. Mm-hmm. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for leisure. But if there were no unions, if there were no labor laws, what boss would tell you to only work 8 hours a day? They'd be like, sure. No, this is all you do. Stay shackled to your desk. We'll put a cot beside it. We'll feed you some meals, but stay here and keep on creating blog posts. Keep on, fixing bugs in the system, keep on building widgets, doing whatever you do. So we're in a really precarious time. I'm concerned, frankly, about the future of work. I'm concerned about the future of our economy. I'm inclined to revisit the second part of that model that I hinted at earlier, the castle model, alienation, about how we're getting further and further away from meaningful work and things that, we do in the moment. We don't see the impact of them necessarily. Some of the work that's especially being done online, that's advancing just a small part of society, I think is just not good for us as human beings. There's a lot that's not working right now. And I desperately hope that conversations like this, my book, Leadership Reinvented, all the guests that you bring on are going to, in some way, shape, or form, turn people in a slightly different direction and help them see that there is a better way to do this. There is a way that everyone can win. It is going to require, however, for those who have obscenely more than others to part with their resources, to be generous, to think about how they can help their fellow person. And I'm not advocating for communism by any means. I'm not advocating for socialism. I'm just advocating for a less obscene version of the system we have right now.
I keep promising to let you go, but there's so much
there. No, this is good. Let's stay,
okay.
Man.
You said a couple of things that I'm not willing to rely on. One is that you expect a future where corporations are more civic minded. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. You also just now said something about you hope the extremely wealthy will be more generous. And I think that both corporations and the very wealthy are on this treadmill where the only thing that's better is more. And that I actually, you said you don't want to turn to communism. Neither do I. Capitalism is fantastic. It's why we have the bounty we have. But we always forget, we always say we're in a capitalist democracy, right?
Yeah.
And we've come to the point now where there's so much money in the hands of so few, and we've allowed money to influence politics so much that your vote means less and less.
Right.
The Americans will say no taxation without representation. What they don't think about is that if you have representation without taxation, what are you voting for? It's an empty shell.
Yeah.
And so, it's not communism to tax production. That's how you get roads and police forces and you know, daycare and stuff like that. And yet we've so I guess I'm if I ever have like a rallying cry, it's not taxation is not communism.
Yes.
Vote for it a little bit.
I am in full favor of taxation. In fact, I wish I could be taxed more. I think I have more than enough, you know, knock on wood, it's taken me a while to get here, but, you know, I have more than enough for myself, for my partner, for my family. I wish I would be taxed more if this money could be meaningfully redistributed to those in society who need that lift, who don't need to be going from paycheck to paycheck, who are struggling because they can't access healthcare or are living in places that have food deserts around them. But, you know, I realize that this mentality is rare, that you and I, the way we think, Tim, is not the status quo. There's a trend that's happening right now in China, and I'm just learning about it, man. It's amazing how the book can be a catalyst for a research process that makes you want to write the same book again, but write it better. And I think that's the curse of writing. As soon as you write the book, it's outdated, right? But
That's
thankfully
right.
with Leadership Reinvented, you know, I think it'll stand the test of time, and early indications are that. But the concept is this: what's happening in China is you're having a lot of youth that are revolting against the 996 and 997 work week. So this is working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days or 7 days a week. Talk about a lack of boundaries where your employer, whether it's, you know, Alibaba or whatever company, wants your complete loyalty and fealty and servitude to the company. And in exchange, what do you get? You get a salary, right? That's the price. But these people are burning out. They're not going through the different rites of passage that an adult would go through. They're not getting married. They're not having kids. You know, they're literally dying for millionaires and billionaires.
Yeah.
You know, I quoted something in my first or second TEDx talk, the Burnout Gamble. I talk about how at the time, 3,000 people in China die every day from working too hard. I don't even want to lift the hood on what the number is right now. That talk was delivered in 2015. I imagine it's close to double. But regardless, what's happening in China right now is this silent revolution where young people are opting out of the system altogether. They're just going on welfare. They're just like, screw this. I'm not going to go to school. I'm not going to compete in the rat race. And in researching this phenomenon some more, I came across a word that I'm still trying to understand called involution. It's an economic term that describes what happens eventually with an agrarian society that has evolved to the point of diminishing returns. And I think there's a productivity law that underscores this quite well. I think it's called Illich's law or Freyci's law. I think it's called Illich's law. It states that after a certain point, productivity diminishes and even reaches negative values. And this happens even with an economy. So what's interesting is where we're at right now, and my cursory understanding. So if there's any economists and economic students listening to this, I apologize in advance. I'm going to butcher this, but I'm still learning. What's eventually going to happen is with advances in technology, it'll become more tempting, even for the most well-intentioned and human-centric leaders, to choose robots, to choose programs, to offload their work to non-human entities.
Why are you saying that in the future tense?
It's happening now, isn't it?
Of course, it's been, well, but I mean, that by itself doesn't alarm me, because the trend has always been our friend in that regard. Like we've Starbucks was invented after 90% of us didn't have to push a plow, right?
But then can I ask you a question, Tim? Why then are leaders still insisting on human beings working 60+ hour work weeks if we have the technology that can reduce the time that it takes to do the same job? I mean, when you consider the average pandemic workday is 3 hours longer than its pre-pandemic counterpart. What the heck? Weren't we supposed to save time?
Well, speaking for myself, especially at the zenith of the challenges with COVID, the extra time was easy to justify because we weren't driving. If you're trapped in a car for 2 hours a day, I think it's pretty easy to say, you know what, thank you, employer. I'm going to make sure we stay afloat, and I'm going to put the extra time in. I think that that's kind of natural. And also, you know, the whole the washroom's right there. I have a private washroom in my office for the first time in my life. I mean, my home office, right?
Yeah,
I have my own cafeteria. I can bring my food
to
my desk anytime I want.
Course.
I don't have to wait in line for 3 hours or I don't have to wait in line in
Hey,
20 minutes at the Starbucks, right?
I heard your office has a front yard and a backyard too.
I know, it's amazing.
Wow.
It really is. You can't see it from space like you can the Apple Center, but so there's that.
I gotta come to York, man. That's great.
Yeah, exactly. But so I wanted to sort of pick, if you look at Amazon, for example.
Okay.
The vibe I get, and I've never worked at Amazon and I've never spoken to somebody who has, but the vibe I get is every human in the distribution center is treated like a placeholder for a robot.
Yeah.
Right. And Elon Musk tried that at Fremont in his factory. He's like, I'm going to have a lights out factory. There's not going to be any people in here. It's just going to spit out cars the same speed or the same rate as a machine gun. They're just going to come out like a robot. And he discovered that people are actually pretty useful when it comes to a complicated endeavor like building a factory to build a car. But in the case of Amazon, I think they've really come to the point where they can. It's not science fiction to imagine turning all the lights off in an Amazon distribution center and having robots do all of it. I mean, it's not science fiction. It's not fiction at all. There's pick and pack machines the size of 10 football fields with little grids, and the little robots scurry around and pick up stuff and put it into a fulfillment. I forget where we were going with this.
I have a thought over there, right? So this is interesting because it came out this morning at the time of recording that in the US, the Teamsters have voted, or I think there was a vote with Amazon in support of unionization. Like 99% of people voted in support of unionization. You're telling me if Jeff Bezos or whoever the chairman is right now had the option to replace all of the workers with robots in the face of this unionization prospect, would they do it? 100%. If the technology existed, they would do it.
Yeah.
But here's the same guy who has enough money to, if you stacked it up, it would go to and from the moon like 34 times. Like, What are we talking about? And people are living in subsistence level. Some people who work in Amazon, right? So
this is the dilemma, because for 100 years, it's been fine. Every time our life the work we've been doing has been mechanized, we found more work to do. Do you imagine a point? This is really going off the rails here, but do you imagine a point in the future when because they have AIs writing sports reports, they're kind of formulaic.
Yep.
And when it comes time to summarize what Elon Musk did today, a robot could probably do that, even though I think I have a certain flair.
Yep.
Right. There comes a point when it really starts to eat into work we never imagined robots doing or computers doing, and it gets a little scary. It doesn't matter how long your kid spends in university.
Right.
And so it gets existential, right? If we manage to engage democratically to make sure that nobody suffers as a result of not having a job, what do we do instead?
Now we're talking, Tim. Now we're talking, because if we accept that the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses of the world have achieved a level of self-actualization, and then we look at the very pioneer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Abraham Maslow, who also coined a term that isn't talked about enough called the psychopathology of normality. And it's this idea that majority of the human population have not even scratched the top of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're still stuck on the bottom 3 rungs. What would happen if everything that can be automated is automated? Okay. And then we solve for their basic human needs. We provide a universal basic income, perhaps. What would happen if people were free to pursue their dreams and hopes and pursue higher education and maybe engage in the sort of work that would help people? What if we had more human beings that could visit long-term care centers and spend time mentoring, being mentored by our elders and caring for them? What if we had more people that were engaged in the creative arts, or more people, doing research and producing great works of literature? And I don't even know. I mean, I think that the residual jobs that will be left once automation runs its course will be jobs that are inherently human. There will be jobs that will require a level of attunement that only humans are capable of, a level of resilience and creativity that human beings are capable of. I don't care what anyone says. I've watched enough science fiction movies and read enough dystopian literature to know that, the humans will, and I sound silly saying this. I am aware of that, because maybe with quantum computing, we can get to a place where computers will be able to make the sort of snap judgments, random decisions that humans are capable of. But I don't know. I think there's 10,000. I think we've got 10,000 years over computers.
Okay.
I think we have 10,000 years of human evolution that have allowed us to synthesize it. When you think about the brain as a computer, this is a computer that is absorbing information subconsciously, downloading it and storing it and keeping it on hand for if and when we need to make a decision. I can't think of even the most sophisticated computer right now that is able to do that without prompt and go on tangents and create connections between seemingly disparate points the way that you and I can, the way a baby can.
Right.
So I think in the end, it's going to be our innate humanity that will help us to overcome this predicament that we're in. And hopefully the jobs that are left in the future will be truly meaningful human jobs.
Yeah. Once
we figured out how to automate, the mundane.
Yeah. Well, sir, you have been, I think the people listening need to know that this is Friday evening that you're giving me. So I am very grateful for your time and your wisdom, Tim, and your generosity.
Thank you.
I have one final question. It might be a simple one, and then we'll wrap up. What leader do you admire?
Oh, wow. The one that I have the biggest leader crush on right now, Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister of New Zealand. Mm-hmm. She is a template that if we were to scale it out across the world, I get chills thinking about how companies could run, how nonprofits, how other governments could run if people adopted the same version of her bright side leadership stack. When you look at her response to the 2019 Christchurch shooting, when you look at her response to the volcanic eruption that took place, when you look at her response to child poverty in the country, when you look at her response to just COVID-19, you see a master at work. And what is that saying? The greatest education in the world is watching the masters at work. Please watch and study Jacinda Ardern, because this is a glimpse into what we could be. That is who I think is the leader du jour, if you will.
Excellent choice. Thank you.
Tim, can I just say one thing in closing, sir? When we began this process, of courting and orbiting one another to do this podcast, and I can't thank you enough for your patience to make this happen. I'm glad that we eventually got to do it. I usually with podcasts get the questions in advance and I can prepare, and all of my ardent followers and listeners, they message me from time to time. They're like, "Hey Hamza, you're starting to give the same answers." When I saw Tim, when you didn't give me the questions, I was like, "Oh yeah, this is going to be a good one. This is going to be a great one." And then I started listening to the podcast and I became a fan. And let me say, this is the most fun I've had on a podcast in a long time. I have fun on a lot of my podcasts, but again, Friday evening, we're kindred souls. I love the way you think. I love what you're doing in terms of curating this very eclectic, but somehow focused group of people to speak about what they do. Thank you sincerely, sir. I hope to return the favor and invite you to my podcast, season 2 of Ideas into Action. I would love to continue this conversation again.
Absolutely. Me too. Thank you so much, Hamza. It's been a real thrill.
This is a lot of fun.
My guest today was Hamza Khan. Hamza's website and information on where to get his book, Leadership Reinvented, will be in the show notes. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and join me for the next show with another unusually well-informed leader in business and technology.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.